The thousand strings of the heart seemed to tangle all at once, ringing endlessly like soft chimes the moment a strikingly handsome young man stood before him. Jitu, whom everyone fondly called Mama, found himself caught in a storm of confusion as he looked at Samir. For the first time, he was seeing him not as the little boy he had once known, but as someone entirely different. Someone captivating, grown, and impossible to ignore. Samir's fitted vest clung to his body, outlining his youthful strength, and Jitu's thoughts betrayed him again and again, drifting into places he immediately tried to suppress. What am I thinking? He scolded himself internally. He's my nephew. How can I even let my mind wander like this? Yet, the truth was complicated. Samir was not his blood nephew, just the son of a neighbor who had always been close like family. Still, even that thought failed to calm the storm inside him. Jitu had known Samir since childhood, had watched him grow, had once lifted him in his arms without a second thought. But now everything felt different. The innocence had shifted into something deeper, something he couldn't quite name but couldn't deny either. Samir, now 19, carried a confidence that made him even more magnetic. Their casual conversations often turned playful, filled with teasing remarks about love and relationships. Jitu would jokingly ask if Samir had found a girlfriend yet, and Samir would laugh it off, claiming he wasn't interested in girls at all. Those moments, though light on the surface, carried an unspoken tension beneath them, something neither fully acknowledged, yet both seemed to sense. One afternoon, when Samir made a teasing remark suggesting that perhaps Jitu himself preferred men, it struck deeper than intended. Jitu laughed it off outwardly, but inside, it unsettled him. How could he guess something I've hidden for years? He wondered. Samir, however, brushed it off as a joke, his carefree attitude masking any seriousness. Yet, from that moment onward, something shifted between them. Their bond, once simple and familial, began to blur at the edges, growing heavier with unspoken emotions. Jitu found himself more drawn to Samir than ever before, while Samir, knowingly or unknowingly, started stepping closer into that space, testing boundaries with playful words and lingering glances. One day, Jitu invited Samir over, using the excuse of his mother's cooking, something Samir loved. When Samir arrived and realized they were alone, the atmosphere felt different, quieter, charged in a way neither openly addressed. Their usual teasing turned into something more intense, their words layered with hidden meaning. What started as harmless banter gradually carried an edge, as if both were circling around something neither dared to name. Samir continued to provoke him with jokes about age and strength, while Jitu responded with mock challenges, trying to keep things light, but failing to ignore the growing tension between them. As their playful argument escalated, it turned physical in the form of harmless wrestling, at least on the surface. Jitu grabbed Samir in a burst of energy, trying to prove he wasn't as old or weak as Samir teased him to be. Samir laughed, resisting, pushing back, their movements filled with energy and closeness. It was still a game, but one that felt heavier with every passing second. Their laughter echoed in the room, yet beneath it, there was something neither of them could fully ignore anymore. Their boundaries blurred in that moment, not crossed in any clear way, but undeniably tested. Pinned down in the end, Samir still laughed, refusing to admit defeat, while Jitu held him there, breathing heavily. Not just from exertion, but from everything he was trying to hold back. Their eyes met briefly, and in that fleeting moment, silence replaced the laughter. It was a silence filled with questions, with tension, with emotions neither had the courage to voice. And though the moment passed as quickly as it came, leaving behind only teasing remarks and half-serious laughter, something had undeniably changed between them. Something that could no longer be ignored, no matter how much they tried to pretend otherwise. The air in the room felt heavier after that moment, like something invisible had shifted between them, settling quietly but firmly into place. Samir lay there for a second longer than necessary, still half-pinned beneath Jitu, both of them breathing slightly harder than before. What had started as teasing and playful wrestling now carried a strange silence, one that neither of them seemed ready to break. Samir was the first to look away, letting out a soft laugh as if to brush it all off, though the faint flush on his face betrayed something deeper. G2, on the other hand, slowly released his grip, stepping back as though suddenly aware of how close they had been. Too close, perhaps, for something that was supposed to be just a joke. Samir sat up, running a hand through his hair, trying to regain his usual carefree demeanor. "Not bad," he said with a smirk, glancing at G2. "Didn't think you still had that much strength." His tone was light, but there was a flicker of curiosity in his eyes, like he was studying G2 now, seeing him in a slightly different way. G2 forced a small laugh, though his mind was still tangled in the moment that had just passed. "Told you not to underestimate me," he replied, trying to keep his voice steady. Yet inside he was anything but calm. His thoughts kept replaying the way Samir had looked, the warmth of his body so close to his, the brief moment where everything else had seemed to fade away. Samir stood up and stretched casually, as if nothing unusual had happened. But there was a slight hesitation in his movements, a subtle awareness that hadn't been there before. He glanced around the room, then back at G2. "So, no food today?" he teased, trying to shift the mood completely. G2 blinked, snapping out of his thoughts. "Oh yeah, I can make something," he said quickly, grateful for the distraction. He moved toward the kitchen, giving himself a moment to breathe, to collect his thoughts, to push away everything that had started to surface. From the kitchen, he could hear Samir moving around, opening drawers, humming softly to himself. It was such a normal sound, yet today it felt different, closer, more present. G2 tried to focus on something simple, like making tea or preparing a quick meal, but his hands weren't as steady as usual. Every now and then, his mind drifted back to the way Samir had laughed, the way he had looked at him, the way he hadn't immediately pulled away. That detail, more than anything else, stayed with him. Samir eventually wandered into the kitchen, leaning casually against the doorframe. "Need help?" he asked, though his tone suggested he wasn't entirely serious. G2 glanced at him briefly, then looked away again, focusing on what he was doing. "You'll probably just mess things up," he said, attempting a light tone. Samir chuckled softly, stepping a little closer anyway. "Maybe, but at least I'll make it interesting." There was something in the way he said it, something playful yet layered that made G2 pause for a fraction of a second. They stood there for a moment, closer than necessary, neither stepping back. Samir reached past him to grab a glass, his arm brushing lightly against G2's. It was a small, almost accidental touch, but it sent a quiet ripple through the already tense atmosphere. Samir didn't comment on it, but he didn't move away immediately either. Instead, he lingered just a second longer before stepping back, as if testing something unspoken. "Relax," Samir said suddenly, noticing G2's stiffness. "Why are you acting so serious again?" G2 exhaled slowly, setting down what he was holding. "I'm not serious," he replied, though it didn't quite sound convincing. Samir tilted his head slightly, studying him. "You are," he said softly. "You always do this. One moment you're joking, the next you're somewhere else completely." G2 didn't respond right away. He didn't know how to explain something he barely understood himself. Samir watched him for a moment longer, then sighed lightly, his tone softening. "Hey, it was just fun, okay? You don't have to overthink everything." His words were simple, but they carried a kind of reassurance, like he was trying to ease whatever tension he sensed. G2 nodded slightly, though the unease didn't fully leave him. "Yeah, I know," he said quietly. And maybe that was true. Maybe it was just fun, for Samir at least. But for G2, it felt like something more complicated. Something that had been building quietly for a long time and was now becoming harder to ignore. They moved back into the main room with their drinks, settling into a more comfortable distance. The conversation slowly returned to lighter topics, college, daily life, random jokes. Yet there was an underlying shift that neither of them acknowledged. Samir still teased him, still laughed the same way, but there were moments, brief, almost unnoticeable, where his gaze lingered just a little longer, where his tone softened just slightly. At one point, Samir leaned back casually, looking at G2 with a half-smile. You know, you're not as boring as I thought, he said. G2 raised an eyebrow. Oh really? That's your big compliment. Samir laughed. Take it or leave it. There was a pause. Then he added, a little more quietly, but seriously, I like being here. Those words, simple as they were, landed deeper than expected. G2 looked at him, searching his expression for any hint of teasing. But for once, Samir seemed completely genuine, and that made it harder to brush off. Yeah, it's nice, G2 replied, his voice softer now. The moment lingered for a second before Samir broke it with another joke, returning things to their usual rhythm. But something had already changed. As the evening stretched on, the distance between them felt both smaller and more complicated at the same time. They sat closer than before without really noticing it, their conversations flowing more easily, yet occasionally interrupted by those quiet, charged pauses. It was as if both of them were becoming aware of something new, something undefined, but neither was ready to put it into words. And somewhere in between the laughter and the silence, the teasing and the hesitation, a new layer of their connection began to form, subtle, uncertain, but undeniably there. The next day didn't begin with anything unusual, yet something about it already felt different for both of them. G2 woke up earlier than usual, sitting quietly for a moment on the edge of his bed, replaying fragments of yesterday in his mind. He kept telling himself it had all been normal. Just teasing, just playful wrestling, just a harmless afternoon between neighbors. But the problem was that his thoughts didn't stay normal for long. Every time he tried to label it as simple, his memory betrayed him, bringing back the exact moments he had been trying to ignore. Samir's smile, his voice, the closeness, the brief silence where everything had felt suspended. Across the street, Samir was also awake, though his morning was far more restless than usual. He lay on his bed staring at the ceiling, one arm behind his head, thinking about the way G2 had reacted yesterday. It wasn't just the physical playfulness that stayed with him. It was the pauses, the way G2 sometimes looked at him as if he was trying to understand something unspoken. Samir wasn't someone who easily overthought things, but even he could feel that something subtle had shifted. It wasn't clear, not defined, but it was there, like a line slightly blurred that could no longer be redrawn so easily. By mid-morning, Samir found himself walking toward G2's house without fully planning to. It wasn't unusual. As neighbors, he often dropped by casually. Still, today felt slightly different as he approached the gate. He paused for a second, adjusting his expression into his usual relaxed smile before stepping inside. "Hey!" he called out casually as he entered the courtyard. His voice broke the quiet morning air, and almost immediately, G2 appeared from inside, looking mildly surprised. "Oh, you're early today," G2 said, trying to sound normal as he wiped his hands on a cloth. He had been doing some small chores, trying to keep himself occupied. Samir shrugged lightly. "Had nothing better to do," he replied with a half-smile. "Thought I'd come see if you're doing something interesting or just wasting time like always." The familiar teasing tone returned, and for a moment, it helped dissolve the tension between them. G2 rolled his eyes. "I was actually working," he said. "Unlike you." Samir laughed and stepped inside without waiting for permission, as if the house itself was an extension of his own comfort zone. He sat down casually, leaning back in his chair. "So what's the plan today, old man?" he asked, stretching his legs out. The word old man was clearly teasing, but instead of responding immediately, G2 just looked at him for a second longer than usual. That pause didn't go unnoticed by Samir. "What?" Samir asked, raising an eyebrow. "Why are you looking at me like that?" G2 blinked, snapping out of it. "Like what?" he replied quickly. "Nothing. Just thinking." He turned away, pretending to focus on something else. Samir watched him closely now, his playful expression softening just a little. "You've been thinking a lot lately," he said casually, but there was a subtle edge of curiosity in his voice. "Everything okay?" G2 hesitated for a moment before nodding. "Yeah, of course," he said. "Just tired, that's all." It wasn't exactly a lie, but it wasn't the full truth either. Samir accepted the answer for now, though his eyes lingered a bit longer than necessary. There was something about G2's behavior lately that felt slightly different. Not obvious enough to question directly, but noticeable enough to stay in the back of his mind. They ended up sitting together for a while, the conversation shifting between random topics. Samir talked about college, about a few friends, about silly things that happened during his day. G2 listened, occasionally responding, but his focus would drift in between, like his attention kept slipping into something else he wasn't ready to acknowledge. At one point, Samir leaned forward slightly while speaking, and G2 instinctively looked at him, only to quickly look away again when he realized how closely he had been watching him. The afternoon slowly stretched on, and the sunlight outside softened, spilling gently into the room. There was a strange comfort in the silence that sometimes settled between their words. It wasn't awkward, but it wasn't entirely normal either. It was something in between, something new. At one point, Samir stood up to grab water, moving around the room comfortably as if he belonged there. G2 watched him without meaning to, noticing the small, ordinary things he never used to pay attention to before. The way Samir walked, the casual confidence in his movements, the ease with which he occupied space. It made something stir quietly in his chest again, something he quickly pushed down. When Samir returned, he noticed G2's gaze again. "You're really out of it today," he said, handing him a glass of water. "What's going on with you?" G2 took the glass, shaking his head slightly. "Nothing," he said again, a bit firmer this time. Samir didn't push further, but he didn't fully believe it either. For a brief moment, their fingers brushed as the glass changed hands. It was nothing, barely a second, barely even intentional, but both of them paused almost at the same time. Samir's eyes flickered down, then back up. G2 looked away almost immediately, taking a sip of water to cover his reaction. The silence that followed was heavier than before. Samir broke it first, smiling lightly again as if resetting the mood. "You're weird today," he said softly. "But okay." He sat back down, stretching again casually, but there was a slight change in his expression now, less playful, more observant. G2 exhaled slowly, trying to steady himself. "And you talk too much," he replied, attempting to return to normal. Samir chuckled. That's not new. But even as they continued talking, something unspoken had already started to form between them. A quiet awareness that neither of them fully understood yet, but both were beginning to feel in different ways. As the evening approached, the atmosphere outside slowly changed, soft golden light spreading across the rooftops, and a calm breeze moving through the narrow lanes of the neighborhood. Samir still hadn't left G2's house, and neither of them seemed in a hurry to end the day. What had started as a casual visit had quietly stretched into something longer, heavier, and more meaningful than either of them had planned. G2 moved around the house doing small things just to avoid sitting still. Every time he paused, his mind started wandering again, and that was exactly what he didn't want. Samir, on the other hand, had settled comfortably, watching him from time to time without making it obvious. There was still humor between them, still light teasing, but underneath it, a different layer had begun to build. Something quieter, more thoughtful. "You've been acting strange all day," Samir finally said, breaking the silence while leaning back in the chair. His tone wasn't teasing this time. It was simple, direct. G2 stopped what he was doing for a moment but didn't turn around immediately. "I told you already, I'm just tired," he replied, trying to keep his voice steady. Samir gave a small sigh, not convinced. "It's not just tired," he said. "It's like, you're somewhere else even when you're right here." That statement landed more accurately than either of them expected. G2 slowly turned around, meeting his gaze for a brief moment before looking away again. For a second, neither spoke. The silence between them didn't feel empty anymore. It felt full. Full of things that were not being said. Full of questions neither wanted to ask directly. G2 finally spoke, softer this time. "Do you ever feel like some things change without you realizing it?" he asked, almost to himself. Samir tilted his head slightly, thinking. "All the time," he replied. "That's just life, isn't it?" G2 nodded faintly, but didn't elaborate, because what he meant wasn't just about life in general. It was about how something in their connection felt slightly different now, even if nothing had officially changed. Samir stood up and walked slowly toward the window, looking outside. "You know," he said casually, "I used to think you were pretty predictable." He glanced back with a faint smile. "But now I'm not so sure." Jitu gave a short, dry laugh. "That's supposed to be a compliment or an insult?" he asked. "Neither," Samir said. "Just an observation." That answer lingered for a moment longer than expected. Outside, the neighborhood was slowly becoming active again. Children playing, people returning home, distant sounds of daily life blending together. But inside the house, everything felt slightly disconnected from that normal rhythm. Jitu joined him near the window after a while, standing at a small distance. They both looked outside without speaking for a few seconds. It should have felt ordinary, two neighbors standing in silence, but it didn't. Samir broke the silence first, his voice quieter now. "I like coming here," he said. "It feels easy." Jitu glanced at him briefly. "Easy?" he repeated. "Yeah," Samir nodded. "No pressure. No pretending." He paused, then added lightly, "Except today. Today you're definitely pretending." Jitu didn't respond immediately. That comment hit closer than expected. Because Samir was right, he was pretending. Pretending that everything was normal. Pretending that yesterday hadn't left traces behind. But admitting that felt dangerous in a way he didn't fully understand. Instead, Jitu changed the subject. "You'll get late going back," he said. Samir shrugged. So your family will call," Jitu replied. Samir smirked slightly. "You sound like you're trying to get rid of me." That made Jitu finally look at him properly. "I'm not," he said, a bit more firmly than intended. Samir noticed the change in tone and raised an eyebrow, but didn't push further. Instead, he softened his expression again. "Relax," he said. "I was joking." But the word relax had a strange effect on Jitu, because relaxing was exactly what he couldn't do around him lately. A few minutes later, Samir finally decided to leave. He stretched slightly near the door, turning back one last time. "Same time tomorrow?" he asked casually, like it was the most normal thing in the world. Jitu hesitated for just a fraction of a second before nodding. "Yeah," he said. Samir smiled. "Good." And then he left. But even after he was gone, the house didn't feel empty the way it usually did. Something about the space still felt occupied, as if his presence had left a faint trace behind. Jitu stood there for a long time without moving, replaying fragments of the day in his mind. Not the words, but the pauses between them, the silences, the looks that lasted a little too long, the thoughts that were almost spoken but not quite. And for the first time, he didn't try immediately to push it all away. The night had fully settled over the neighborhood, wrapping the streets in a quiet stillness broken only by distant sounds of life continuing elsewhere. Jitu sat alone in his room, though alone didn't feel accurate anymore. Ever since Samir had left, the house had returned to silence, but it wasn't the same silence as before. This one felt heavier, more aware, like it carried echoes of everything that had happened during the day. He tried distracting himself with small tasks, checking his phone, adjusting things around the room, even switching on the television, but nothing held his attention for long. His thoughts kept drifting back to Samir. Not in a dramatic way, not in a clearly defined way, just fragments. A smile here, a voice there, a moment of silence at the window that had lasted just a second too long. Jitu leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes briefly. "This is stupid," he told himself. "He's just a neighbor, a young guy with too much energy. Nothing more." But the problem was, his mind didn't respond to logic as easily as he wanted it to. Across the street, Samir was in a similar state of restlessness, though he tried to hide it differently. He lay on his bed scrolling through his phone, switching between apps without actually reading anything. Every few minutes, he would pause and stare at nothing in particular, replaying bits of the day in his head. The way Jitu had looked at him near the window. The way he had gone quiet when Samir pointed out he was pretending. the small hesitation before agreeing to meet again. Samir wasn't someone who easily got stuck in overthinking, but today felt different. There was something about G2's behavior that had pulled his attention in a direction he couldn't fully understand yet. It wasn't obvious. It wasn't loud. But it was there, like a subtle shift in air pressure you only notice once it changes. He turned onto his side and sighed. "What's wrong with him today?" he muttered to himself, though even as he said it, he wasn't entirely sure he wanted an answer. The next morning arrived with soft sunlight filtering through the narrow streets. Life in the neighborhood resumed its usual rhythm. Shopkeepers opening shutters, children heading to school, neighbors greeting each other from doorsteps. It all looked normal from the outside. But between G2 and Samir, something subtle had already changed. Later that afternoon, Samir showed up again at G2's house. This time, he didn't announce himself loudly or jokingly. He simply walked in as he usually did, but there was a slight pause in his step at the gate, as if he was unconsciously checking something before entering. G2 was inside, sitting with a cup of tea. When he saw Samir, he raised his eyebrows slightly. "You again," he said, though his tone wasn't annoyed. Samir smirked faintly. "Disappointed?" "No," G2 replied quickly. "Just surprised you're this free all the time." Samir walked in and sat down across from him. "I could say the same about you," he replied casually, but his eyes lingered a little longer than usual. There was a brief silence. Not uncomfortable, but noticeable. G2 broke it first. "Tea?" he asked. Samir nodded. "Sure." G2 got up to make another cup, and Samir leaned back, observing the room. It felt familiar now, but today it felt slightly different. Not because the room had changed, but because of how he was experiencing it. When G2 returned, he placed the cup in front of him without much eye contact. Samir thanked him softly, then took a sip. "You always make it slightly too strong," he said. G2 shrugged. "That's how I like it." Samir smiled. "Maybe I'm getting used to it." That line hung in the air for a second longer than expected. G2 looked at him briefly, then looked away again, focusing on his own cup. "You get used to everything eventually," he said quietly. Samir tilted his head. "Not everything." The way he said it wasn't argumentative. It was calm, certain. Another silence followed, but this one felt different again. It wasn't empty, it was layered. Outside, a bicycle bell rang. A dog barked somewhere in the distance, and life continued as usual. But inside that room, the atmosphere was slightly suspended, like both of them were standing at the edge of something unspoken. Samir leaned forward a little. "You've been acting different," he said again, softer this time. "Not just yesterday, even today." G2 didn't respond immediately. He turned the cup slowly in his hands, thinking. "Maybe you're imagining it," he said finally. Samir shook his head. "No, I'm not." That was the first time he sounded completely sure. G2 finally looked at him properly. For a brief moment, their eyes met without distraction. No jokes, no interruptions, just awareness. Then G2 exhaled and looked away again. "People don't stay the same," he said. "That's all." Samir studied him for a moment longer, then nodded slowly. "Yeah," he said. "I guess not." But neither of them said what they were actually thinking, because both of them had started sensing the same thing. Something shifting quietly between them, something neither had named yet, but both were now aware of. And once something becomes noticeable, it rarely goes back to being invisible again. The days that followed didn't bring any clear answers. Only repetition, silence, and small moments that felt heavier than they should have. G2 and Samir continued meeting as neighbors normally would, yet nothing about their interactions felt entirely normal anymore. It was as if an invisible thread had formed between them, pulling quietly even when neither of them acknowledged it. Samir still showed up at G2's house almost every day, sometimes with a reason and sometimes without one. He would joke, tease, and act the same way he always had, but now there were pauses between his words, subtle moments where his attention lingered just a little longer than before. G2 noticed it too, even though he tried not to. One afternoon, the sky outside turned cloudy, heavy with the promise of rain. G2 was sitting near the window when Samir arrived, shaking off his shoes at the entrance. "Looks like it might rain," Samir said casually, stepping inside. His voice was normal, but his presence felt more noticeable than usual. G2 nodded. "Yeah." That single-word reply should have ended the conversation, but it didn't. Samir didn't move away. Instead, he stayed standing near the doorway, watching G2 for a moment longer than necessary. There was something in his expression today, not playful, not teasing. Something quieter. "You've been quiet lately," Samir said finally. G2 looked up. "I'm always quiet." "No," Samir replied softly. "Not like this." The room fell into a pause again. Outside, wind brushed against the windows, making the atmosphere feel even more enclosed. G2 exhaled slowly, setting down what he was holding. "What do you want me to say?" he asked. Samir shrugged slightly. "Nothing specific." Then after a beat, he added, "Just don't act like I'm not noticing it." That sentence landed differently. G2 stood up slowly, walking toward the other side of the room as if creating distance would help him think more clearly. "Noticing what?" he asked, though he already knew the answer wasn't going to be simple. Samir took a step forward. Not aggressive, not sudden, just a step closer. "That something changed," he said. "Between us." G2 didn't respond immediately. His eyes lowered for a moment, as if searching for a way to deny it that felt believable, even to himself. But nothing came out. Outside, thunder rolled softly in the distance. Samir continued, his voice lower now. "At first I thought I was imagining it, but it keeps happening. The silence, the way you look away, the way you pause before answering me." G2 finally looked at him again, more directly this time. "And what if I am just distracted?" he asked. Samir held his gaze. "Then why am I also distracted?" That question shifted something in the room. For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. The rain began lightly outside, tapping gently against the windows, filling the silence that neither of them could. G2 sat back down slowly, as if the energy in him had softened. Samir also lowered himself into the chair across from him, but this time there was no casual ease in his posture. The space between them still existed, but it felt different now. More aware. "I don't know what you think is happening," G2 said finally, quieter than before. "But you're reading too much into things." Samir gave a small, almost tired smile. "Maybe," he said, "but I don't think I am." Another silence followed, but it wasn't empty anymore. It felt full of unsaid words. G2 stared at the floor for a moment. "Samir," he began, then stopped. Hearing his name said like that made Samir straighten slightly. G2 continued, slower now. "You should focus on your own life. College, friends, things that actually matter." Samir leaned back slightly, studying him. "And what if this matters to me too?" he asked calmly. That question stayed in the air longer than anything else had. G2 didn't answer, because for the first time, there was nothing easy or safe to say. The rain outside grew a little stronger, and inside the room, both of them sat in a silence that felt less like emptiness, and more like the beginning of something neither of them were ready to name yet.